What if the billionaire martial artist wasn't the strongest one in the room? What if the quiet man with a mop was holding a strength she couldn't measure, and a son whose silence told the truth she refused to hear? This is the story of when an 8th Dan Aikido master worth billions challenged a single dad to spar. He looked up with calm gray eyes and said, "Only if you promise not to cry. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has gone." At precisely 9:02 a.m., the dojo breathed with the scent of cedar and disinfectant. The glass doors closed with a whisper as Clara Vance entered. She never announced her visits. She never needed to. Her flawless navy blazer and the soft staccato of her heels against polished wood silenced chatter more effectively than a bell. Everyone noticed her. Everyone always did. Clara wasn't just a sponsor. She was the name behind Vance Defense Systems, the empire that had rescued this community Aikido center from bankruptcy. To the instructors and students, she was untouchable, an 8th Dan black belt CEO and billionaire who carried herself with marble poise. Yet Clara hadn't come for recognition. She came because the noise of her boardroom still echoed inside her bones. She came because restlessness never let her sleep. She stood still at the edge of the tatami, scanning the hall. That's when she saw him. A man in a gray maintenance shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, moved silently across the mats with a wide mop. His long brown hair was tied back loosely, and his calm face bent toward the task, as if the world outside didn't exist. His motions weren't the clumsy swipes of a janitor rushing through chores. Each pass of the mop was fluid, precise, like breath made visible. It was practiced. It was controlled. It was beautiful in its economy. Clara took a step closer, her heels tapping softly. He didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He simply continued the quiet rhythm of mop to mat, as though her shadow weren't falling directly across his path. Interesting. Most people stiffened when Clara entered a room. They stood taller, smiled harder, tried to impress. But this man, nothing. She narrowed her eyes, curious despite herself. "You're not a student here," she said at last. "I clean the place," he replied, still focused on the floor. Clara folded her arms, arching a brow. "Doesn't mean you can't learn. Ever sparred?" Finally the man looked up. His eyes were gray-blue, unreadable, not defiant, not submissive. Just steady, anchored. And then he said it quietly, clearly, without hesitation. "Only if you promise not to cry." The words struck like a crack in temple silence. The mop froze mid-air. One of the younger instructors faltered mid-demonstration, mouth open. Even the director at the front desk turned. It was as if time held its breath. Clara didn't move. Inside, though, the words landed sharp, a sting she didn't expect. Cry. No one dared suggest weakness to her. No one. She tilted her chin. "What makes you think I'd lose?" Her voice was cool as glass. The man shrugged, lowering his gaze back to the mop. "I didn't say you would." His tone carried no arrogance, no mockery, just that same calm. "And yet you warned me." Clara pressed. "I didn't." He pushed the mop again, smooth and silent. "I made a request." Her jaw tightened. Around them, the air was thick-charged, as though everyone in the dojo had felt a tremor only she couldn't name. Clara stared at him another long 5 seconds. He didn't waver. Then she turned, walking toward the observation area with her spine rigid. She never looked back. but something in her posture had shifted a hairline crack in marble. The janitor, Daniel Cross. That was what the director had called him once in passing. Clara filed the name away, but pretended to forget it. She told herself she didn't care. She told herself she wouldn't think about him again. But she did. Even as she sat at the rear of the dojo, notebook balanced on her knee, her pen tapped restlessly. She wasn't watching the students. She wasn't listening to Sensei Nolan's instruction. Her mind looped back to one line, "Only if you promise not to cry." It wasn't bravado. She knew bravado. It wasn't challenge either. The words had carried something else, gentleness, almost protective, wrapped in quiet defiance, and that was what unsettled her most. Why should she care what a janitor thought? Why should she feel anger prickle beneath her skin, anger she couldn't even explain? The mop slid beneath his hands with ease, and he never looked her way again. But Clara felt his presence pressing against her thoughts, the way a scar aches in the cold. By the time the class ended, she should have left. She had a calendar waiting, shareholder calls, strategic updates, rehearsals for a keynote speech. Instead, she lingered near the glass exit. The air outside shimmered against her heels, but her eyes drifted back, toward the man at the maintenance closet coiling a hose with the same unhurried grace. And that was when she saw him. Not Daniel, but the boy. A small child with sandy hair sitting cross-legged with a notebook. Drawing. The boy's eyes were solemn, too old for his years. When he caught her gaze, he didn't smile. He didn't even blink. He simply stood, tore the page from his sketchbook, and walked over. His sneakers made no sound. Clara crouched as he handed her the drawing. No words, no explanation. He just turned and returned to Daniel's side. She unfolded the paper. The sketch was simple, childlike but unmistakable. A woman in a dojo hair, pulled tight posture rigid, her face stern, and above her head, not sunlight, rain. Something tightened in Clara's chest. She folded the paper with care and slipped it into her leather folio. She turned heels, striking hard against cedar as she left the building, eyes forward, but thoughts trailing behind her like shadows. For the first time in years, Clara Vance felt unsettled by someone who had no rank, no title, no power, only a mop, a child, and a single disarming line that refused to leave her mind. The silver sedan slid into the narrow parking lot 2 mornings later. Clara Vance didn't normally revisit dojos. Routine was for the undisciplined, she always said. She preferred to rotate between sites, appear when no one expected her, keep everyone sharp. Yet here she was again at Westbridge Engine, ticking softly in the cool air. This time she wasn't wearing heels. She had told her assistant she needed to evaluate instructional consistency. That explanation satisfied them. It always did. No one questioned Clara Vance. Still, she knew the truth. She wasn't here for program reports. She was here because of a janitor who told her not to cry, and a boy who had handed her a drawing that felt like it had come from her own buried memory. She pressed her palm against the steering wheel a moment longer, then exhaled, stepping out. The morning smelled of cedar again as the dojo doors closed behind her. Students shifted nervously, glancing up from their warm-ups. Clara walked with her usual erect posture, but inside her thoughts were tangled. She nearly missed him at first. Not Daniel Ethan. The boy was seated alone on a wooden bench along the side wall, cross-legged sketchpad balanced on his knees. His sandy hair fell across his forehead, and his shoes were scuffed at the toes. The pencil in his hand moved steadily, almost stubbornly, as if he didn't notice the adults around him. Clara's heels slowed her stride, faltering ever so slightly. She would have walked past entirely, but then his eyes lifted. They weren't childlike in the way most 7-year-old eyes were. No awe, no timidity, just presence, unfiltered. "You must be Daniel's son," Clara said softly. The boy didn't answer. Ethan, right. Still nothing. His pencil scratched against the page. Clara, who could command boardrooms of generals and CEOs with one raised brow, felt something she hadn't in years: awkwardness. Her throat tightened. "Well, nice to meet you." She gave the faintest nod and walked on. But as she reached the corner, she felt it. His gaze lingering on her back, weighty, deliberate, until she disappeared from view. The class was already in session. White G's moved in rhythm, Sensei Nolan's calm voice guiding them through fluid redirections and roles. Clara took her seat in the rear notebook balanced on her knee, but her eyes scanned the room for someone else. 20 minutes later, he appeared. Daniel Cross emerged from the side door bucket, rolling 2 folded mats resting across his shoulder. His motions were quiet, efficient, belonging more to the walls than to the people. He didn't stride like a man demanding notice. He simply existed, blending into the silence between movements. When Clara's eyes caught his, he nodded once. Not a smile, not smugness, just acknowledgement. She held his gaze longer than she intended. But he was already looking away, his mop sliding into rhythm along the tatami's edge. Her pen tapped against the notebook, meaningless scribbles filling the margin. For a woman who prided herself on control, Clara hated how much this unsettled her. At lunch break, Clara lingered. She pretended to check flooring near the training ring, pointed out scuffs to the director. Nothing urgent, just excuses to stay close. Her gaze found him again. Daniel sat on the floor near the supply closet, adjusting a ventilation panel with a screwdriver. Ethan sat beside him, sketchpad in his lap, pencil moving steadily. They weren't talking. Every so often Daniel glanced at the page, nodded faintly, then returned to his work. It was peaceful, grounded. Clara had spent her adult life in boardrooms full of men straining to be louder, faster, sharper. She knew the sound of dominance, the crash of egos clashing like swords. This silence wasn't absence. It was presence. It was something she had never quite known. She stood watching longer than she should have. Then she turned to leave. "Miss Vance." The voice wasn't Daniel's. It was Ethan's, soft but steady. She froze mid-step. The boy walked toward her sketchpad, clutched in both hands. He stopped just 2 feet away. His eyes, that same unblinking presence, held hers. Then he extended the paper. Clara hesitated, then took it. Ethan said nothing more. He turned and returned to his father's side. Clara unfolded the drawing. It was simple, crude even, but heavy with meaning. A woman in a gi stood in the center of the page. Her posture was strong, yet slumped. Around her, heavy gray lines fell like rain. One hand clutched her chest, as though hiding something inside. The other hung limp. Her face was expressionless, but broken. Clara's throat tightened. Her fingers shook slightly as she folded the page. She slipped it into her coat pocket as if it were fragile glass. When she looked up, Daniel was watching her. He didn't ask what Ethan had shown. He didn't need to. Their eyes held for one beat too long before Clara turned sharply, heels clicking, posture rigid. That evening, Clara stood alone in her penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling glass reflected her own image, back hair in its perfect knot, spine straight as steel. The city below glimmered like fallen stars. Her phone buzzed with calendar alerts, investment updates, endless noise. But all she saw was the sketch. She unfolded the page again, laying it on the marble counter. Rain falling over a woman who looked far too much like her. And for the first time in years, Clara Vance wondered whether someone, some child, had seen something she had spent half her life hiding. The boardroom gleamed like a sterilized operating room glass table, chrome carafes, a skyline thrown across the window like a map of constellations someone tried to pin down with steel. Vertical integration, international rollout. Projected risk voices said around Clara Vance as if reading from a hymnal. Pens clicked. A slideshow flickered. Someone laughed too loudly at a joke about margins. Clara's hand rested on a folio of numbers that used to thrill her. Today they might as well have been weather reports from a city she'd never visit. Ms. Vance, the merger timelines moved up, said a VP with a perfect tie. We'll need your sign-off by Friday. Friday, Clara echoed. The syllable drifted and vanished against the glass. Behind her calm face, something else played on an endless loop. A pencil drawing of a woman beneath slanting lines of rain, and the memory of a janitor's quiet eyes when he said, "Only if you promise not to cry." She looked down and found her pen tapping the page. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats, as if knocking softly at a locked door. When she noticed, she stilled it at once. Around the table their faces were expectant. She could have navigated this blindfolded. She could have signed, adjusted, pressed forward. But a thought uncoiled in her like steam. You're not here and you know it. The meeting ended on time, as her meetings always did. People stood smoothed jackets, smiled the way people smile when they're close to power. Clara thanked them, voice smooth as silk over stone. The door closed behind the last suit, and the silence that followed was not a relief. It was a verdict. She opened her leather folio and took out Ethan's sketch. The edges were already soft from her touch. Rain sketched in blunt gray, a woman's hand over her heart as if holding in a storm. She placed the page flat on the table and stared at it, until the city outside her window blurred, until memory rose like altitude sickness. The mountain air had been thin that day, so clean it burned. Pines bowed and whispered. Sam had been 16, all elbows and wishbone courage. He'd hesitated at the switchback, mustering a smile to cover fear. "Let's go another day," he'd said. "I'm not feeling right." She remembered her own voice, bright with the certainty of people who have never fallen. "You need to finish what you start, Sammy. Strength isn't a mood." The gravel's sudden hiss, the scrabble of his hands, the way he'd looked back over his shoulder as the ledge crumbled, eyes not angry, not even betrayed, just tired. "I'm not you, Clara." Then nothing. The trail was quiet again, except for the ragged sound of her breath. "Ms. Vance," her assistant said from the doorway, gentler than usual. "The car's ready." She folded the drawing carefully, slid it back into her folio, and nodded. She did not go home. The Westbridge Community Dojo sat in the long afternoon glow sunlight pooling on the lobby tile like warm honey. The air inside held its familiar blend of cedar and clean sweat, soft with the scuff of bare feet. Clara didn't seek permission to enter the equipment hall. She followed the sound of a screwdriver clicking patient metallic sure. Daniel Cross was crouched by an open panel near the floor sleeves pushed to his forearms. A small, tidy row of screws lined the baseboard like silver seeds. Next to him, Ethan sat on a folded mat knees tucked under drawing. He hummed 3 notes, a pause, 3 notes, the same rhythm as her pen had tapped. Daniel glanced up, a quick nod acknowledgement without performance. "Didn't think we'd see you again this week," he said, turning one last screw. His voice had a firefighter's steadiness made to cross a room no matter how hot it got. "I rotate," Clara answered, then surprised herself by adding, "And then I return sometimes." He slid the panel into place and stood. Up close he was leaner than she'd thought, strong in a way that suggested old work, the kind that leaves the body whittled but upright. She heard her own voice ask a question she hadn't prepared. "What did you do before this?" He wiped his hands on a folded rag. The pause that followed wasn't guarded so much as careful. He looked at Ethan, at the graphite smear on the boy's thumb, at the small paper nest of discarded sketches. When he looked back at Clara, he didn't blink. "Fire," he said. 12 years. She felt the word more than heard it. "You left. I did." "Why?" The overhead vent hummed. The mats breathed back a quiet smell of soap and practice. Ethan added a shadow to a line of roof tiles in his drawing and did not look up. "There was a collapse," Daniel said. "No theatrics. Bare plank words laid down between them. My wife was inside." His jaw tightened once, like someone adjusting a load on his shoulder, making sure it wouldn't fall. "I was first on scene." Clara's breath faltered. She had not planned to be the one caught without air. I'm sorry," she said. The words felt too small, but she offered them anyway, the way you offer a hand in the dark. Daniel nodded once, a thank you that didn't require her to carry more. After that, he continued, "I couldn't walk into another burning room, but I could still show up. Here." He gestured to the ceiling, the walls, the hum of the place. "Floors need cleaning. Fans need fixing. Kids need somewhere to be while their fathers learn how not to disappear." Clara turned that over like a smooth stone in her mind. Learn how not to disappear. It sounded like a skill you couldn't put on a resume and couldn't live without. "Does the work feel small to you?" she asked, hearing the steel in her own question and despising it as she did. He didn't bristle. "Small things keep people standing," he said. "Trust me, you notice when the small things fail." Behind him, Ethan set down his pencil and reached into his backpack. He pulled out a pale blue square of paper and began folding crease-turn-crease, every motion precise without being fussy. Clara watched his small hands move. Paper became wings. "Your son," she said quietly, "sees more than most adults I know." Daniel's mouth softened. "He sees what people try not to say." He nudged a coil of cable back into the closet with his foot. "He's the reason I don't hurry." "And you?" Clara asked the question out before she could layer it with distance. "What keeps you from hurrying?" A ghost of a smile. "People break when you rush them." Clara looked past him to the training hall. Students bowed in pairs, palms brushing the mat with a sound like autumn leaves. She felt a shift, small, internal, the movement of something wedged long ago. The mountain air again, the ledge, Sam's voice. "I'm not you, Clara." She swallowed. "My brother fell," she said, and the words startled her, as if someone else had spoken. She set a hand on the doorframe because she needed the feel of wood to remember where she was. "A long time ago. I told him to be strong." Daniel didn't reach for her story. He didn't ask her to retrieve every shard. He stood where he was, a steady point. Sometimes he said, "Strength looks like stopping." Ethan finished the crane and held it up to the light. He didn't offer it to Clara, not yet. He turned it in his hands, as if asking the paper bird a question, then set it in his lap and began shading a tiny mountain on one wing. "I should go," Clara said, though her body didn't move. "I have Friday." He didn't pretend to know what that meant. "We'll be here," he said simply. She nodded and stepped back into the corridor. The dojo's afternoon breath met her warm and patient. At the front desk, she paused. Her reflection in the glass hair, neat shoulders squared, looked like a woman anyone would bet on. She pressed 2 fingers against the folio at her side, where Ethan's rain-washed drawing rested. The paper answered with the barest crinkle, the way a hand in the dark may squeeze back. Outside, the sky was gold at the edges, city noise softening as if someone turned the dial. Clara slid into the sedan, but she didn't tell the driver to move. Through the windshield, she could see the dojo door, and for a fleeting second the small outline of a boy holding up a paper bird to check its balance. The wings caught the light. "Home?" Ms. Vance, the driver, asked. "Not yet," she said. After a beat, "Tomorrow." She didn't mean the office, and when the car finally pulled away, the feeling in her chest wasn't triumph or dread. It was something stranger, quieter, the sense of a knot loosening thread by thread, as if the story she'd been telling herself about strength was making room for a different ending. The Westbridge dojo hummed under late morning light. Rows of students, bowed hands, brushing tatami with a whisper. Clara stood at the rear, arms folded, her gaze sharp but distracted. She wasn't here to monitor technique today. Her eyes flickered past the crisp white GIs and landed again and again on the quiet man near the corner. Daniel, crossed sleeves, rolled mop in hand, head lowered as though the rhythm of cleaning carried its own philosophy. She'd tried to put distance between them, to file him away like any other detail unworthy of her attention, but his words still pressed into her mind. "Only if you promise not to cry." And worse, the way his son's crude drawing had exposed a storm she'd buried for almost 20 years. She told herself the boy was guessing, that children often sketched rain. But she knew better. "Excellent flow," Sensei Nolan said, correcting a student's posture. He was gentle, steady, the kind of teacher who built confidence grain by grain. Clara respected him. But today her respect was fractured. Her attention was elsewhere, and that was when the disruption came. An older man, stocky, folded arms pressed against his black GI. Sensei Hartwell, visiting from a nearby affiliate, had been invited to observe. He was proud of his lineage, the kind who mistook volume for authority. His eyes narrowed on Daniel, mopping in the corner. His lip curled. He leaned closer to Clara, voice pitched just loud enough for others nearby to hear. "A janitor mopping the mats during a master's lesson. Not exactly the discipline I remember from real dojos." The words cut across the room like a dull blade. Subtle, but enough. A few students faltered mid-step. Clara felt heat flare in her chest. She opened her mouth, ready to snap the man in half with a look, but she didn't have to. Daniel set his mop aside. He rose to his feet slowly, not rushing, not theatrical. His calm presence drew every gaze. He bowed slightly toward Hartwell, his voice low, even. "I'm here to mop floors, not egos." The silence was immediate, thick, heavy. Hartwell blinked, caught off guard. No snappy retort came. No one moved. The air seemed to bend toward Daniel's words, recognizing a kind of dignity that couldn't be manufactured. Daniel picked up his mop again and returned to his work without another word. Clara's heart beat unsteady. She turned back to the class as if nothing had happened. Her voice carried across the room. "Let's repeat the blend from the second grab." The students moved, grateful for instruction to break the tension. But her eyes stayed with Daniel even as her mouth explained technique. Hours later, after the students had left and chatter dwindled to echoes, Clara lingered. The dojo smelled faintly of sweat and cedar oil. Golden beams from the high windows stretched across the empty mats. She stood near the glass arms folded tight, her mind replaying the scene. "I'm here to mop floors, not egos." The line shouldn't have mattered, but it did. It mattered because he'd said it without bravado, without needing to win. She found herself drifting toward the far corner. The mop rested against the wall where Daniel had left it. Almost without thinking, she picked it up. The handle was worn smooth, the wood darkened by use. She pressed the mop head to the tatami, sliding it across. Back and forth. The motion was grounding, soothing, a ritual older than thought. Her breath fell into rhythm. Mop forward, pull back. The sound was soft, almost like a bow repeated again and again. Clara Vance, billionaire CEO, 8th. Dan, master woman, whose name moved governments, stood alone mopping the floor she once funded. For once, she wasn't thinking about optics. She wasn't thinking about boardrooms or press or power. She was thinking about dignity, about the way some people carried it silently, without stitching it to uniforms or plastering it on walls. The dojo was empty, no cameras, no audience. Just her, the mop, the fading breath of the building. When she finished, she leaned the mop against the wall, stood in the center of the mat. Sweat beaded along her brow. She breathed deeply, feeling not the triumph of accomplishment, but a strange calm she hadn't known in years. That was when she saw it. At first she thought it was a scrap of paper caught near her shoe. But when she bent down, she realized it had been folded carefully into a small paper crane. She lifted it delicately. The wings trembled between her fingers. She unfolded it. Inside, in slightly crooked handwriting, were words that stopped her breath. "You lost a match, but not to my dad." Her pulse quickened. She looked around the empty dojo. No one was there. No footsteps, no sound, but her own heartbeat. The note was simple, almost innocent. Yet it carried the weight of truth in a way only a child could deliver. She folded the crane again, cradled it in her palm. Later that night she set it on her penthouse bookshelf beside Ethan's earlier drawing. 3 silent tokens, 2 made of paper, 1 etched into her memory. Together they spoke louder than the voices of her entire board. And for the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to wonder maybe strength wasn't about how much you could carry. Maybe it was about how gently you could put something down. The storm came in the middle of the night, not outside, but in her chest. Clara Vance jolted awake, sheets damp against her skin, the penthouse air conditioning humming too softly to dry the sweat streaking her temples. The city skyline winked through the glass towers, lit like watchmen. But all she could see was the mountain. The trail twisted back into focus, the pine-scented wind cutting sharp in her lungs. Her younger brother Sam, walking ahead, nervous energy in every step. He was 16, still growing into his body, and she 10 years older had believed discipline could shape him like steel in fire. "Let's go another day," he'd begged, his voice cracked with the effort of masking fear. "Please, Clara, I don't feel right." She had smiled the way only the confident can. "Strength doesn't come from comfort, Sam. You need to finish what you start." She could still hear the crunch of gravel loosening the sharp cry, his arms flailing against the sky. She had turned just in time to meet his eyes as the ledge gave way. They weren't angry. They weren't pleading. They were tired. "I'm not you, Clara." Then silence, a silence that had lasted 18 years. She pressed her palms hard against her face, forcing herself back to the present, but the memory refused to let go. The storm had found her, and it wasn't leaving. At dawn, Clara drove. She didn't plan her route. Her car seemed to know where to take her. The dojo was empty when she arrived, Matt's untouched windows breathing in soft gray light. She stepped barefoot across the tatami, each board creaking softly under her weight. For a moment, she simply stood listening to her own breathing. It felt like standing at the edge of the cliff again, waiting for the rocks to crumble. Then she saw it. On the low platform near the folded GIs lay another origami crane, pale blue this time. She bent hands, trembling slightly, and unfolded it. The handwriting was steadier than before, but still the unmistakable hand of a child. "You don't need to be stronger. You just need to forgive." Her throat caught. She sat down on the mat, the paper crane curling gently in her palm. The dojo smelled faintly of cedar and soap. The world outside hadn't woken yet. For the first time in 18 years, Clara whispered the words she had never allowed herself to say. "I'm sorry, Sam." The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't even steady. But it was real. Her voice cracked against the silence, a small surrender finally admitted to the empty air. She bowed her head, not in ritual, but in grief. Later that day, the dojo was alive again, students practicing roles, instructors guiding with steady hands. Clara sat at her usual place, back rigid expression composed. Yet her eyes kept straying toward the maintenance corner. Daniel Cross was kneeling by a loose hinge, adjusting it with methodical care. His son Ethan sat cross-legged, sketchbook open, tongue pressed to his lip as he shaded the outline of a figure. The boy didn't look up, but Clara felt the weight of his presence like a hand on her shoulder. She studied Daniel's movements, slow, deliberate, the kind of patience learned in fire. She thought of what he had told her days ago about his wife, about the collapse. She thought of the way his jaw had tensed, not with anger, but with the effort of carrying something carefully so it wouldn't break further. Clara's gaze drifted to Ethan again. The boy's pencil moved like it was guided by something older than him. She wondered if he knew what he was doing when he folded those cranes, if he understood the power of his small, crooked letters, or if he simply trusted the silence to do the work adults always smothered with noise. The class ended. Students' bowed chatter filled the hall. Clara lingered, waiting until the room thinned. She walked toward Daniel, stopping just a few feet away. "Your son," she began, but the words faltered. Daniel looked up. His gray-blue eyes met hers without flinching. "What about him?" Clara swallowed. "He sees things." Daniel's mouth softened, though his gaze stayed steady. "He sees what people don't say." Clara nodded faintly. She wanted to tell him about the dream about Sam, about the storm that had chased her across nearly 2 decades. But she couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she said softly, "Your cranes. They're unsettling." Daniel glanced at Ethan, who was still sketching in his corner. "They're his," he said simply. "Not mine." Clara looked down at her hands, fingers curling against her palm. She thought of the pale blue crane folded carefully in her coat pocket. She thought of the words written in a child's uneven hand. "You just need to forgive." And for the first time, she didn't feel offended by the truth. She felt seen. That night, Clara sat in her penthouse with the 4 paper cranes laid out on the glass table in front of her. The city glowed beneath her, but she didn't see it. All she saw were wings folded by small hands and words written by someone who shouldn't have known her story, and yet somehow did. Her life had been built on armor, on victories, on silence sharp enough to cut. But now, surrounded by cranes and crude sketches, she realized strength wasn't always in winning. Sometimes it was in admitting what had already been lost. She touched the pale blue crane tracing the creases. For the first time in years, she let the storm inside her breathe. Not enough to drown her, just enough to remind her she was still alive. By late afternoon, the dojo was a bowl of warm light. Sun spilled in long rectangles across the tatami, gilding dust motes as they drifted like slow, weightless snow. The air smelled of cedar and the faint salt of effort. Clara Vance stood at the front of the class in a plain white gi belt tied with surgical neatness, jaw set in that quiet line that had once intimidated generals. She told herself she was fine. The cranes were folded and tucked away. The dream had receded to where old storms go. "Partner up," she said, voice even. "We'll begin with blending off a second grab. Listen for the center before you move." The students bowed and paired. Palms met, feet slid. Fabric whispered. A teenage boy, narrow-shouldered, determined, hesitated. He reached for his partner and pulled back as if the air were a hot stove. Clara watched the flinch. The shallow breath, the eyes skittering toward the floor. She crossed to him, steps quiet, the way she'd crossed 1,000 rooms expecting obedience to follow. "Again," she said gently. "This time, breathe." He nodded, tried. The moment his partner's hand touched his wrist, the boy froze, body braced for impact that never came. He fumbled a pivot, feet tangling, caught himself. His cheeks colored. Clara's throat tightened. "Reset," she said, sharper than she meant to. The boy swallowed, set his stance. He reached and stopped, a small wince flickering at the corner of his eye. That was all it took. The thin seam that held Clara's day together split. Sam's voice found her. "I'm not you, Clara." And the mountain's grit slid under her tongue. The boy's hesitant hands looked like her brother's. "No," she said too quickly. "You're anticipating. Aikido is not flinching at ghosts. It's listening." Again. He tried and stumbled forward, arms pinwheeling in a move that wasn't technique so much as apology. The fabric hissed against the mat. Other pairs slowed, heads turned. The room listened not with ears, but with nerves. "Stop," Clara said. The word cracked like a branch in winter. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was frightened. The teenager's gaze dropped shoulders, hunching as if he could make himself smaller than the scolding. Clara felt her breath climb her chest and stick there hot and mean. This was not who she was on the mat, and not who she wanted to be anywhere. From the doorway, a voice traveled in like cool water poured down a heated blade. "Seems like the floor doesn't need cleaning today." Clara turned. Daniel Cross stood there with a folded towel over one shoulder, a spray bottle in his hand, not crossing the threshold, not challenging. His gray-blue eyes were steady. The smallest hint of a smile tugged at them, not at her expense, but as if he were speaking to the room's nervous system, rather than its ranking belt. "It's already crying," he added softer. Something let go. Not of control, of pretense. The students looked anywhere but at Clara. She returned her gaze to the boy and found to her deep embarrassment that her own hands were shaking. She drew in a breath that scraped the edges of her lungs. "Class dismissed," she said, voice even again. "Work repetitions at half speed, then stretch. I'll see you tomorrow." No one argued. The bow was scattered and grateful. People filed out murmuring. Someone cracked a joke to crack the tension. The sound fell flat. Clara walked not fast, not slow into the back corridor, and as the door swung closed behind her, the performance slid off her like a heavy coat. She leaned her back to the cool wall and the tears came, not wrenching, not loud, but clean as rain through a dusty screen. 18 years of holding her breath met a hallway with no witnesses. She cried the way strong people cry when the room finally stops measuring them. She thought of Sam, a boy's thin wrists, stumbling feet that were trying and terrified. She thought of all the times she'd called fear a weakness instead of a weather report. The hallway hummed with the building's exhale. Somewhere an old vent ticked as it cooled. The door opened a crack and closed without a latch clicking. A paper rustle touched the air, a whisper of wings. Clara pressed her palms to her eyes, once more inhaled to steady herself, and when she pulled her hands away, a small yellow shape sat at her feet just inside the line of light on the linoleum. A crane. She crouched and picked it up, fingers careful as if the slightest rush might tear it. She knew whose hands had made it. She could see the imprint of them in the neat, earnest creases. She unfolded the bird with the reverence of opening an old letter. Inside, in blocky print, tilting uphill, a message: "You were loud because you were scared." On one wing, penciled so lightly, she almost missed it, a single tear. Clara closed her eyes. The paper was soft from being handled as if Ethan had held the little bird a long time before deciding to let it go. She folded it again and cradled it in her palm. There was no accusation in the note, and perhaps for the first time since the mountain, she didn't load it with one. It read like recognition. Like a hand squeezed twice, I see you. You're here. She washed her face at the tiny sink in the janitor's closet because it was nearest, and because the water came out cold, pure. She caught her reflection in the spotted mirror and did not reprimand it. She only watched the woman there breathe until the pulse in her neck calmed. By the time she returned to the mat, the students were gone. Empty space met her supple and forgiving. She stepped to the center, bowed to no one, and felt the bow back. A soft scuff announced Daniel before his voice did. He didn't come close. He stayed by the edge where the sunlight thinned into shadow. "Everything all right?" he asked, careful with the question as if it had corners. "Not yet," she said, and there was no performance left to hide it. "But I think I'm done mistaking hesitation for failure." Daniel nodded, and the acceptance in that small motion moved through her more gently than any apology. "Hesitation saved my life once," he said. "Taught me where the fire was before I walked into it." Clara managed a breath that tasted like the first one after surfacing. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't for the sentence, though it helped. It was for knocking on the door without breaking it. He tipped his head toward the hall. "He wanted to leave that for you. Said the yellow was sunshine." She looked down at the crane in her hand, at the single drawn tear on its wing, a little comet caught in paper sky. "It is," she said. They stood in companionable silence, a kind that didn't require filling. When he finally turned to go, he left her with nothing eloquent, just steadiness. "We'll lock up when you're ready." She stayed a while longer, letting the room be a room and not a test. Outside, the evening was taking its time. The light went honey-colored, then wheat, then the thin blue of porcelain cooling. On her way out, she slipped the crane into the inner pocket of her jacket where important papers went. The weight was nothing, but it changed how the fabric lay against her, the way a hand at your elbow changes your balance when you don't know you need steadying. The street smelled faintly of rain that hadn't fallen. The sky held itself ready. She walked to the car without hurry, the corridor's coolness still on her skin, the boy's handwriting warm in her chest. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, students and their tremors, mats and their memory, a mop, leaned against a wall like a patient instrument. She did not try to script it. She only knew this: she would step onto the floor with a quieter mouth and a better ear. She did not yet know how absence could reshape a room. She would learn soon enough. 3 days passed. At first Clara barely noticed. The dojo still opened on time, mats gleamed, instructors rotated through their lessons, voices echoed with the same cadence she'd always heard. But beneath the surface something was missing. A thread had been pulled loose from the weave, and though no one else seemed to feel it, she did. On the first day she found herself glancing toward the corner where the mop usually rested against the wall. Empty. The supply closet stayed shut. She told herself it was coincidence that Daniel and Ethan had errands that she had no reason to notice. Yet her gaze kept straying back, searching for what wasn't there. On the second day the absence pressed harder. No mop strokes whispering against tatami, no gray-blue eyes catching hers in silence. No small sneakers padding across the floor to hand her folded paper or drawings that cut sharper than any blade. The corridors echoed hollow. She told herself it didn't matter. She had a business to run, a reputation to uphold. But her thoughts betrayed her. They kept circling back. By the third morning she woke earlier than her alarm, restless. She didn't bother with her usual routine of checking overnight messages or scheduling briefings. She dressed quickly, hair in its tight bun, and drove to the dojo before the first class began. The building stood quiet, bathed in the pale light of dawn. She stepped inside, breath tight. Something waited for her. On the bench near the entrance, propped gently against her stainless steel water bottle, sat a folded sheet of white paper. Not a crane, not a sketchbook page torn haphazardly. A deliberate fold, neat but flat. Clara reached for it with careful fingers. She unfolded it. The drawing was different this time, slower, more deliberate. 3 figures stood on the tatami. She recognized herself immediately, not by her bun or posture, but by the weight in her stance, the lines drawn heavy around her shoulders. To her left, Daniel, hands calm at his sides. To her right, a boy, but not Ethan. Older, shaded with light strokes, blurred but present. A student. One of hers. Above them, in Ethan's uneven handwriting, "You don't have to win. Just come back." Clara stared at the words until the letters blurred. Her throat tightened. She pressed the paper to her chest, folding it carefully back into its neat square, slipping it into the inner pocket of her jacket, as though it were a contract more binding than any she'd ever signed. 15 minutes later, she stood on the sidewalk of a modest brownstone tucked in a quiet neighborhood. The paint on the fence was peeling the lawn in need of trimming. A pickup truck sat in the driveway, its paint dulled a dent near the fender. She wasn't supposed to be here. She didn't visit people's homes unannounced, not ever. Not even her own executives. But her knuckles found the door before her thoughts caught up. She knocked once. The door opened. Daniel stood there, surprised but not startled. His gray-blue eyes rested on hers without a word. Behind him, Ethan hovered half-hidden, clutching a juice box, eyes wide with that unblinking calm. Clara inhaled, pulled a paper from her bag, and placed it in Daniel's hands. He unfolded it. It was a completed application form already signed. Request to assist in special training sessions, Community Children's Program. Under desired role, She had written in her neat hand, "Assistant Instructor Volunteer." Daniel looked up slowly. He searched her face as though weighing not just the form, but the meaning behind it. Clara didn't smile, not with her mouth, but her eyes softened, her cheeks eased, her armor cracked just enough. "I don't need to lead," she said quietly. "I just want to stand where it matters." For the first time in a long while, Daniel's expression shifted. His lips curved faintly, the kind of smile born not from amusement, but from recognition. From behind him, Ethan stepped forward. He held a folded square of yellow paper. Not a crane this time, just a square plain and direct. Clara accepted it, unfolding carefully. Inside, in large block letters written with the uneven hand of a child, "This is the part where you bow." Clara's breath caught. Then unexpectedly, she laughed. The sound startled her. It had been years since it had come out that way, unpracticed, warm, alive. She bowed, not perfect, not ceremonial, but real. Ethan grinned. Daniel stepped aside, holding the door open. "I think," he said softly, "we can make room." Clara walked through the doorway without another word, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't feel like she had to prove her place to enter a room. That evening the dojo lights glowed soft as she stood barefoot on the tatami. Daniel knelt organizing mats. Ethan sat cross-legged nearby, sketching again, his pencil whispering across paper. There were no cameras, no executives, no shareholders waiting on her word. Only 3 figures preparing quietly. Clara bent down to help Ethan with a stack of small practice pads. "Who was the boy in the drawing?" she asked, gently. Ethan didn't look up. His pencil never stopped. "Someone waiting for you to come back." Clara blinked. She didn't press. Some lessons, she realized, weren't meant to be explained. They were meant to be felt. The dojo smelled of fresh tatami and tea that someone had steeped too long in the back room. Clara Vance stood barefoot near the edge of the mat, dressed in a plain white gi with no insignia, no rank. Stripped of her titles, she felt strangely naked and strangely free. The children gathered near the center were not like the advanced students she'd once demonstrated for. They were a mixture, some shy, some withdrawn, some neurodiverse, each carrying invisible weights in the slope of their shoulders and the way their eyes darted nervously around the room. Clara had been asked to assist the class, and though she carried more knowledge of Aikido than anyone in the building, she realized knowledge wasn't what these kids needed. She turned, searching for the quiet steadiness she had come to depend on. Daniel was kneeling near the wall, fixing a loose board with deliberate patience. His sleeves were pushed back, forearms corded with quiet strength. Beside him, Ethan sat cross-legged with his sketchbook humming softly, pencil tapping like a heartbeat. Clara crossed the mat, lowered her voice. "Daniel, I need your help with this group." He glanced up, surprised. "Me? They're not responding to standard instruction," she said. "I think you could reach them." Daniel tilted his head. "I'm not a teacher. You teach your son. That's different." Clara stepped closer. "You don't push. You listen. You wait. That matters." He looked over at the group of children, one of whom was staring at the floor as if the mats might swallow him whole. Daniel's jaw tightened faintly. He shook his head. "I fix things, Clara. Floors, doors, sinks. I'm not qualified to stand there." Her voice hardened with an edge she hadn't meant to show. "Do you think I would have asked if I didn't believe you could?" She paused, breath catching. "Or is it that you're afraid to be seen doing something that matters?" For a moment his eyes darkened, not in anger, but in something closer to sorrow. "Some things don't need to be seen to matter," he said quietly. Clara's chest tightened. She didn't know if it was his humility or her pride that stung worse. Her mouth opened to argue, but before she could, a small hand slipped into hers. She looked down. "Ethan." The boy's eyes lifted wide and steady. His voice was soft, but it carried weight far beyond his years. "My dad teaches well. Grown-ups just don't listen." Clara's breath caught. The words pierced her in a way no boardroom confrontation ever had. Ethan squeezed her hand once, then returned to his sketchbook as if the matter were settled. Daniel watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. Lines around his mouth softened. He said nothing, but Clara could feel the shift, subtle and real, like the ground steadying after a quake. She turned back toward the children, her voice gentler now. "All right, let's start again. Slowly this time. No rush." The boy, who had been staring at the floor, lifted his eyes hesitantly. Clara offered her hand. He flinched, then took it. Together they moved through the motion, halting but intact. From the corner of her vision, Clara saw Daniel watching. His face was still, but there was something in his eyes, gratitude maybe, or guilt. She couldn't tell. That evening, the dojo emptied. Shoes shuffled, chatter echoed the building, exhaled its day. Clara lingered, clipboard in hand, pretending to review attendance notes. She stayed until the sound of voices faded to silence. Daniel passed by with his mop bucket, pushing it toward the closet. He didn't stop. He didn't look at her. But just before disappearing down the hall, he said without turning, "I'll think about it." Clara froze. The words echoed louder than any promise she'd heard in years. She let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Later, when she reached for her bag on the changing bench, she found something tucked beneath it. Another drawing. This one showed 3 figures on the mat, a woman, a man, and a child. The woman stood tall, in the middle expression unreadable. The boy held her hand. The man stood beside them. But one detail struck Clara like a blow. Only 2 shadows stretched across the floor, Daniel's and Ethan's. The woman had none. Clara folded the drawing carefully, slipped it into her notebook. For the first time in years, the silence around her didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace. The following week, Clara walked into the dojo wearing the same plain G hair tied simply, no jewelry, no titles clinging to her frame. She stepped onto the mat not as Sensei Vance, not as CEO Vance, but simply Clara. She bowed slow and deliberate. Daniel stood across from her waiting. He didn't bow first. He let her choose the pace. For once, she did. Evening settled on the dojo like a warm hand, and the last of the children's giggles thinned into hallway echoes. The mats held the day's memory footprints pressed faintly in the weave a scuff, where someone had learned how to fall and stand again. Clara Vance tightened the knot of her plain white belt and stood facing Daniel Cross. No insignia, no titles, just breath. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded a small, unhurried bow. "Ready." They began with distance, not the measure of feet, but of history. Clara stepped into the space between them, the way a diver reads the surface before cutting in, chin-level shoulders. Loose eyes softened so she could see more than edges. Daniel shifted weight like a tree, adjusting to wind rooted without stiffness. Their hands met lightly, palm to wrist. Not a clash, but a question. "Where are you?" Clara moved first a testing spiral, the kind that had thrown men twice Daniel's size before they knew they were airborne. Daniel yielded not with the collapse of someone giving up, but with the precision of someone saying, "You don't have to push that hard. I'm already moving." His redirect flowed under her technique like groundwater under stone, difficult to see until you felt it cooling your steps. She smiled without meaning to. "You're not where I expect." "Expectation's a doorway fear likes to stand behind," he said, voice even. She feinted right. He caught the intention in her shoulder before her foot committed. He went to blend, and she pivoted, drawing his center, offering a throw she had drilled since the year she learned to command a boardroom. He didn't fight the arc. He rode it to the mat and tapped palm crisp against tatami, then rolled up with a small grin that felt like a secret between colleagues after a long meeting. "Point," Clara said, a little breathless. "It's not tennis," he answered, but the grin remained. They flowed again. She led with a low sweep she hadn't shown him yet. He answered with an almost lazy sidestep that turned her momentum into air and put her off balance long enough for his hand to find her sleeve and encourage the idea of a fall without insisting on it. She let the idea bloom, felt the mat meet her, and laughed at the ceiling, the kind of laugh that sounded like a compromise struck with yourself. From the doorway, paper rustled. Ethan sat cross-legged, small, back against the jam sketchbook open across his knees. He didn't speak. He drew them as two shapes, with lines between not ropes, not arrows. Lines like music. They circled, breathing in the same slow cadence, a conversation that asked and answered with hips and shoulders. Clara's technique was a language she spoke with flawless grammar. Daniel answered in a dialect pushed into him by 12 years of fire and 1 day of unthinkable collapse. Neither corrected the other. They translated as they went. "Again," she said. He nodded. This time, when she slid for control, he gave her what she wanted and then showed her it wasn't necessary. Her grip softened. His did, too. They moved until it felt not like proving anything, but returning something gently to the shelf where it belonged. Her foot slipped, not a failure, just the mat's reminder that even masters are held to friction. Daniel's hand was there without urgency, catching her elbow, not saving her, just offering purchase. Their eyes met at arm's length. In his, she saw none of the things that used to make her tighten, no victory, no assessment, only presence, the kind that makes crying impossible and therefore unnecessary. She exhaled. The last coat of performance slid off her shoulders. "One more," she said. They began. She offered a textbook entry. He accepted and folded it into a pin that would have impressed a room full of judges because it committed without aggression. She tapped. He released it once, stepping back as if giving her space was a piece of the technique. It was. They sat side by side at the edge of the tatami feet, bare backs leaning against the same wall. The night outside pressed its cool face to the high windows. The dojo smelled like soap and a late pot of tea someone had forgotten. For a few breaths, neither of them tried to make meaning. They let the sweat on their forearms dry to a salt-lit sheen. Daniel broke the quiet, first not looking at her. "Do you ever wish you could win?" He let the question sit there, simple as a glass of water on a table between friends. "Just once. Against me." Clara turned, studied the sharp line of his cheek and the gentler one beside it. The past rose boardrooms, the mountain, the boy who flinched earlier that week. She could have said something clever. She didn't. "No," she answered, surprising herself with how easily it came. "I just want to stop losing to myself." He nodded with a small smile, like he'd been waiting for her to say it, not to prove him right, but so she could hear how it sounded in the air. "That's harder," he said. "But it lasts longer." Ethan scooted closer, right up to the boundary where mats met wood, and held out 3 paper fans he'd folded from handouts someone had left on the front desk. He gave one to Clara first. On it he'd drawn a tiny mountain with a figure climbing, not triumphant, just steady and small hands and feet exactly where they needed to be. Daniel's fan held a spiral storm or heart. Clara couldn't tell, maybe both. On his own, the boy had sketched 3 stick figures holding hands, their shadows long, and in a child's logic, the same length, even though one was smallest. Clara cleared her throat around the unexpected ache the drawings put there. "You always bring the right props," she told Ethan. The boy shrugged, pleased with himself, but pretending otherwise. "I just draw what's true." They stayed like that a while, the 3 of them, fans fluttering lightly, the room cooling from the day. When Daniel finally stood, he did it with an unhurried grace that made standing feel less like leaving and more like honoring a room. He offered Clara a hand. She took it, and rose, their palms parting with a soft sound that felt like the close of an honest conversation. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" His tone made it plain he wasn't fishing. "For not trying to win," she replied. "And for not letting me either." He chuckled, towel over his shoulder. "Wise guy once told me winning and fixing aren't the same thing." She tilted her head. "You're quoting yourself now." He feigned outrage. "I'd never." Ethan slid his sketchbook into his backpack and tugged the zipper with a practiced care that spoke of years of making sure small things didn't spill. "Can we get noodles?" he asked, the first practical sentence anyone had spoken for an hour. Daniel looked at Clara. Not an invitation with strings, just a question aimed at a shared now. She considered the ceiling as if menus might be written there among the rafters. "I could eat noodles," she said. They didn't go, not yet. Instead, they took a slow lap of the dojo, checking windows, writing a stack of pads, rescuing a stray belt from beneath a bench. None of it needed both of them, but they did it together anyway, as if the room might like to be closed by people who had learned how not to rush each other. At the lobby corkboard, a flyer had worked loose at one corner and breathed with the building's small drafts. Clara set it straight, smoothing a thumb across the heading, "Statewide Community Aikido Demonstration." Her face didn't change, but something in her posture eased the way a line of script looks when the hand that's writing it finally trusts the sentence it's in. She flicked the edge of the paper once and stepped back. Tomorrow, she said, not to make a plan, but to let the day know it had a next chapter. Daniel turned off the last light, leaving only the blue from the parking lot to glaze the mats. Ethan held the door solemn in the way children are when they know closing a place is not the same as ending it. They walked out together into air that smelled like new rain, considering its options. On the threshold, Clara glanced at the flyer again through the glass. She didn't need a stage to know what had shifted. But if a stage appeared, she suspected she might finally know how to stand on it without armor. Outside, someone somewhere slammed a car door. Laughter drifted from the diner up the block, and the city went on being a city. Inside, the mats kept their quiet promise. Tomorrow, this room will still catch you. The city gymnasium smelled of varnished wood and anticipation. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their pale glow across rows of folding chairs, already filling with parents, curious onlookers, and the occasional martial artist dressed in a crisp G. The banner strung across the stage read in bold black strokes, "Statewide Community Aikido Demonstration." Clara adjusted the knot of her belt, her fingers betraying a faint tremor. For years she had addressed investors, commanded boardrooms, and wielded the authority of wealth and status without hesitation. Yet standing here in a plain gi with no titles, She felt exposed in a way that those stages never achieved. Daniel leaned against the far wall, arms folded, watching with a calm steadiness that made the room's chaos recede. Ethan sat beside him, sketchbook balanced on his knees, pencil darting with quick strokes that captured everything, the nervous tilt of his father's shoulders, the curious bend of Clara's head as she scanned the crowd, even the glint of light off the polished hardwood. "Don't look so terrified," Daniel murmured as Clara passed near him. "They're just people," she offered a thin smile. "So were shareholders. And you handled them." His tone was matter-of-fact. "This is easier. These ones actually want to be here." Before she could answer, the announcer stepped up to the microphone. His voice boomed, bouncing across the rafters. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for an exhibition of Aikido from dojos across the state. Our first demonstration will feature Clara Vance." A ripple moved through the crowd. Clara caught it, whispers, double takes, recognition. The name still carried weight. Some muttered admiration, others skepticism. She forced her steps steady, moving toward the center of the mat as eyes followed. She bowed. The hall quieted. Daniel pushed himself off the wall, stepping forward. His GI was plain sleeves, a little too short belt, showing wear from years of hands pulling it tight without ceremony. He joined her on the mat, bowing as well. The announcer's voice carried again. Her partner for tonight's demonstration, Daniel Cross. If Clara's name caused ripples, Daniel's caused silence. No one knew him. No one recognized him. He was simply a single father in a G that had seen more washing machines than judges' panels. But his calm presence radiated in a way titles couldn't replicate. The referee called Hajime. They began slowly. Clara moved with sharp precision, her techniques clean and exact, the embodiment of years of disciplined training. Daniel matched her not with the refined showmanship of a master, but with an uncanny ability to blend, to redirect her force, as if he'd been waiting for her moves all his life. The crowd leaned forward. Murmurs turned into gasps when Clara attempted a throw meant to display her control. Daniel flowed with it, turned, and gently pinned her to the mat in a seamless motion. He didn't gloat. He released her instantly, offering a hand. Clara accepted it, rising with a faint smile tugging at her lips. For the first time, she wasn't here to dominate. She was here to share. They circled again. This time, Clara let Daniel lead. His movements were less polished, but alive with instinct, the rhythm of someone who had learned not from books but from life's insistence. She followed, adapting, turning what could have been competition into dance. Ethan's pencil flew faster, capturing the moment, his father's quiet strength and Clara's elegant form wove into one picture. A voice broke the silence, one of the spectators incredulous. "Who is he?" Clara heard it, so did Daniel. He didn't answer. He simply moved, throwing her into a roll that she landed smoothly, popping back to her feet, with laughter that startled even herself. The demonstration lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours compressed into heartbeat after heartbeat. When the referee finally called an end, the crowd erupted, not polite applause, but the kind that rises when people witness something they didn't expect. Clara bowed again, sweat glistening on her forehead, chest rising and falling with exertion. Daniel bowed beside her. Their eyes met hers, alive with relief, his calm as ever. As they stepped off the mat, the announcer rushed forward. "Incredible," he said, eyes wide. That was unlike anything we've seen." Clara smiled, faintly, shaking her head. "It wasn't me. Daniel gave her a sidelong glance. "It wasn't me either. It was both of you." Ethan piped up from his seat, waving his sketchbook. On the page he'd drawn them not as two fighters, but as twin spirals circling balanced, neither dominating, both essential. The crowd continued to buzz as the next pair prepared to take the stage, but something had shifted. The whispers now weren't about Clara's wealth or Daniel's anonymity. They were about presence, balance, and the way two people had made a room forget titles altogether. As they left the floor together, Clara leaned close enough for only Daniel to hear. "Do you realize what you just did?" He shrugged. "I just promised not to make you cry." She laughed, the sound rich and unguarded, echoing across the gym like a declaration. The buzz of the demonstration still lingered long after Clara and Daniel stepped out into the cooling night. The gym doors closed behind them, muting the applause still spilling out for the next performers. The parking lot hummed with cicadas' headlights sweeping across cracked pavement as families gathered their things and drifted home. Ethan walked between them, clutching his sketchbook to his chest, as if it were the most valuable prize of the evening. He kept glancing up first at his father, then at Clara, then back down at his drawing. His small voice finally broke the quiet. "They'll remember you both." Daniel chuckled, sliding his hands into his pockets. "Pretty sure they'll forget me by breakfast." Clara turned her head, studying him. "I doubt that. You stole the air out of that gym without trying." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "You did the work. I just kept you honest." They walked the short distance to Daniel's truck, its paint faded and dented from years of errands and late-night shifts. It looked out of place in a lot filled with sleek sedans and luxury SUVs that had ferried other dojo's families. Clara lingered a step behind, her gaze drifting over the battered vehicle. For years she had measured worth in the shine of chrome and the thickness of leather seats. Now, standing here, she saw something else, a quiet durability that outlasted polish. Ethan climbed in first, still flipping through pages of sketches. Clara stood with her hand resting on the doorframe, hesitating. Daniel noticed. "You don't have to ride with us," he said softly. "I know this thing isn't exactly—" She cut him off, her voice firm. "I want to." He blinked, then nodded. She slid into the passenger seat, the cushions sinking under her in a way that made her realize she hadn't ridden in a car this ordinary in decades. The air smelled faintly of motor oil, crayons, and peppermint gum, a scent of lives lived, not curated. As the truck rumbled to life, Clara found herself exhaling tension she hadn't noticed she carried. The hum of the engine filled the silence until Ethan leaned forward between them. "Can we get noodles now?" Daniel smiled. "Yeah, buddy. Noodles it is." The small diner sat 2 blocks from the gym, neon letters buzzing above its windows. Inside booths were filled with families, kids, and GIs still bouncing from adrenaline. The trio slipped into a corner booth, the vinyl seats cracked but comfortable. A waitress with kind eyes and a practiced smile dropped menus on the table. "You two were the talk of the demonstration," she said, nodding at Clara and Daniel. "Never seen a pair move like that." Clara thanked her with a faint smile, but Daniel waved it off. "We were just showing up." The waitress winked. Sometimes that's the hardest part. When she left, silence settled for a moment, broken only by the clatter of dishes and the sizzle from the kitchen. Clara leaned forward, folding her hands. "Daniel, why do you hide it?" He looked up from the menu. "Hide what?" "Your ability, your presence. Tonight proved it. You could stand in any dojo, any stage, and hold your own against the best. Yet you choose this quiet corner's invisible places." His eyes dropped to the table, He traced the rim of his water glass with one finger. Because visibility doesn't always mean freedom. Sometimes it's just another kind of prison. Her chest tightened at the quiet weight in his voice. You've carried something heavy for a long time, haven't you? He didn't answer right away. Ethan rescued him, blurting out, Dad says winning isn't the same as fixing. That's why he doesn't fight unless it matters. Daniel gave his son a grateful look. Clara let the words settle their simplicity sharper than any polished speech. Their noodles arrived, steam curling up like soft banners. Conversation paused while they ate. It felt almost domestic, the scrape of chopsticks, the occasional clink of a glass, Ethan slurping happily without apology. Clara found herself watching Daniel more than her food. The way he listened to his son with full attention, nodding as though every word mattered. The way his shoulders finally loosened when laughter escaped. She wondered if this was what power really looked like, not in empires, but in small, faithful presence. After the meal, as they stepped back into the night, Clara glanced at him. Daniel, what if I said I wanted more than sparring, more than a demonstration? What if I wanted to understand the part of you keep locked away? His jaw tightened, eyes scanning the street as though searching for an escape route. Careful, Clara. Some doors don't close once you open them. She held his gaze, unflinching. Then maybe they weren't meant to. Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve, breaking the moment. Dad, can we show Clara the roof? Daniel blinked confused, then smiled faintly. The roof, huh? Guess it's tradition now. 10 minutes later, they climbed the narrow metal ladder outside their apartment building. The roof spread out under the stars, patched tar and stray gravel glinting faintly. The city stretched around them, lights, sirens, the low hum of life. Ethan darted to his usual perch near the ledge, flipping open his sketchbook. Daniel stood beside Clara, hands in his pockets, watching the boy. This is where we come when the world feels too loud. She tilted her head back, gazing at the endless scatter of stars above the skyline. It's quiet up here. Honest. Daniel's voice dropped low. That's why I keep us here, on the edges, where nobody expects anything except presence. For the first time that night, Clara slipped her hand into his, not for show, not as strategy, simply because it felt right. He didn't pull away. Ethan glanced up from his sketchbook, grinning. Told you she fits? The boy went back to his drawing. Clara's breath caught as she realized he was sketching them again, two figures side by side, holding hands under a sky full of stars. Daniel squeezed her hand lightly, his words quiet but firm. Clara, if you walk into this part of my life, it won't be about titles or stages or power. It'll be about late-night noodles and roofs that leak when it rains. It'll be about Ethan. She looked at him, her voice steady. Then that's exactly where I want to be. And for the first time in years, the woman who had built empires felt as though she had finally stepped into something real, something that couldn't be bought, only chosen. Morning rinsed the rooftops clean. Dew beaded along the railings of the brownstone ladder they'd climbed a few hours earlier, and the city sounded like it had forgiven itself, buses sighing, a bakery doorbell chiming down the block, pigeons negotiating air rights in the alley. By the time Clara Vance reached the dojo, the sun was already laying slow gold across the mats. She slipped off her shoes, set them neatly on the rack, and stepped barefoot into that hush she had come to trust. Daniel Cross was already there, sleeves pushed to his forearms, coiling an extension cord the way you coil a thought you're finished carrying. He looked up as she crossed the floor. No rank on either of them, no insignia, just fabric, skin, and breath. Couldn't sleep, he asked. Didn't want to. she said, and the truth of it surprised them both. Near the side wall, Ethan knelt over his sketchbook, tongue caught between his teeth, pencil marching with purpose. When he sensed Clara, he stood and approached, cupping something in both hands as if it might fly away. A crane white this time, edges slightly softened from being carried too long. He placed it in her palm, closing her fingers with his small, warm ones. She unfolded it carefully. On one wing, in tidy letters that leaned like saplings in a steady wind, you cried. But this time it was to grow. Clara swallowed. She didn't thank him right away. She only pressed her thumb to the crease, feeling the way paper remembers the hands that shaped it. When she did speak, it came out quiet. "I think I finally know why people bow," she said. "It's not to show who's above or below. It's to show you're willing to meet." Daniel set the cord on the shelf, watching her with that firefighter's stillness that never asked for spectacle. "Then meet me," he said, "not a challenge, not even an invitation, more like a doorway left open and the porch light on." They took their places at the center. No spectators, no clock. The building around them breathed like an old friend happy to be woken early. They bowed. The bow bowed back. Clara moved first, a slow spiral shaped by instruction and softened by the last few weeks. Daniel received it with the kind of listening you can't fake. Their hands met palm to palm, bone to bone, then parted and met again, that quiet conversation of wrists and attention. He redirected without erasing her. She accepted without disappearing herself. Harmony, not surrender. Her foot crossed his weight, turned. She chased a line she would have forced a month ago, and instead let it arc into open space. He let her borrow his balance just long enough to find her own. When she misread his shoulder and started to insist on a throw that wasn't there, she heard the old voice that used to run her finish, "What you start," and chose a different ending. Her grip loosened. Her breath did too. The movement solved itself. They traded places. Daniel entered not hard, just sure, and when he found her center, he didn't pin it like a specimen. He set it down, then stepped back the way you return a fragile thing to the shelf it belongs on. She tapped a soft acknowledgement. He released, already gone. From the corner, Ethan drew lines that were less like bodies and more like weather, two currents in a river, deciding together how to go around a rock. Every so often he looked up to check whether truth still matched his pencil. It did. Again, Clara said, smiling. This time she tried a sweep he'd learned to respect, and he answered with a blend that would have put her on her back last month. Today, it simply turned her, until she found him not as an opponent, but as a partner, standing where she needed to be. They laughed, a sound that landed like sunlight on wood. They worked in and out of contact, and the room changed with them. The boards under the mats stopped feeling like a stage and started feeling like a porch. The high windows hummed with new traffic outside, but the dojo kept its vow here: time slows until it matches breath. It was not a fight. It was not even practice for a fight. It was a choice, two people deciding for 1 hour to move through a world without breaking it. She pinned him once clean textbook, and when he tapped, she felt no surge of victory, just the quiet pleasure of having chosen the exact amount of strength required, and not 1 ounce more. He caught her later with a simple entry that made her laugh because it was so obvious she'd have argued with it yesterday and accepted it now. When he let her up, they stayed close for a beat longer than technique demands, their forearms resting side by side, warmth buzzing in that notch between elbow and wrist where touch feels most honest. They ended because the hour did not, because there was anything left to prove. They sat at the edge of the tatami legs, out feet bare backs, against the same wall that had heard so much of their old stories. Clara ran a palm along the woven mat, feeling the faint ridges the way labor leaves texture. "I thought strength was a straight line," she said at last. "From start to finish. From fear to victory. But it isn't, is it?" Daniel considered. "I used to think it was a door you kicked in. Turns out it's a hinge you oil." She laughed, and the sound didn't echo. It soaked in. Ethan scooted over, tucking himself between them. "I drew you like weather," he announced, flipping his sketchbook around. "Two currents, yes, but also small birds in the margins, folded triangles in flight. Because you don't crash anymore," he added matter of fact. "You listen." Clara looked from the page to the boy. "Who taught you to see like this?" He shrugged. "You did, when you didn't make me talk." They packed the morning away in small kind motions, stacking pads, checking latches, cracking the back door to let the cedar air cycle through. No one rushed. When Daniel reached for the mop, Clara's hand touched the handle first. She lifted it, smiling. "Let me." He raised an eyebrow. "You're overqualified." "I'm finally qualified," she said, and the stripe she drew down the mat was straight enough to count as a sentence. They left the floor better than they found it, that was all. That was everything. At the doorway, Daniel hesitated. Not out of doubt, out of respect for thresholds. "Clara," he said, "name like a full stop. If we step off this mat and keep choosing, it won't be fireworks." "I've had fireworks," she said. "They're loud and gone." She tipped her head toward Ethan, who was busy corralling a runaway roll of athletic tape. "I'm ready for porch lights." He nodded, and what moved through his eyes then wasn't triumph or relief. It was recognition, the look of a man who had been standing at an open door for a long time and was glad to see someone step through without being dragged. They didn't hold hands leaving the dojo. They didn't need to. They matched pace. That small miracle felt larger than vows. Outside, a breeze pushed the morning a half-step cooler, and somewhere a kettle sang in a neighboring apartment. The city went on with its bigness, but the three of them had found a scale that fit. On the sidewalk, Ethan slipped between them and reached up without looking. Two hands found his. Three shadows stretched in front of them, different lengths, same direction. Clara felt the old mountain lift off her shoulders, not all at once, not forever, but enough that the next breath came easy. They turned the corner toward late breakfast, toward noodles probably, and a hardware store stop for a hinge Daniel wanted to replace, and Clara realized something simple that had taken her decades healing isn't a headline. It's a series of choices you keep making when no one's clapping. It's a mop leaned against a wall like an instrument, a bow given when there's no audience, a paper bird that tells you the weather inside your own chest and dares you to walk out into it unafraid. "Tomorrow," Daniel said, as if careful not to bruise the air with too much hope. "Tomorrow," she answered, and for the first time she wasn't racing it. She was walking toward it, found rather than chasing. Word count 1083. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.